Yes, good afternoon, and I'm really happy to be able to share our experiences from one of the other expert groups that has been working in Southeast Asia. So I'm presenting this on behalf of the SIANI expert group on agroforestry in Mekong. Since I was available in Sweden, we thought it was no point to really fly anyone all the way here now. So this is the longer name of the expert group on agroforestry for food and nutrition security, sustainable agriculture and landscape restoration. And you can read a lot more on various blogs that Rob Finlayson, who has been coordinating, has been writing during the course of the 2018 when the project has been running. So when we talk about agroforestry here, we talk about integration, trees, crops, landscape, trees, crops and livestock, but in a multifunctional landscape perspective. So we look at different aspects, and you will see that when we come along. Because what we really have been supporting here is to translate both scientific and practical knowledge and skills into policy. So that is sort of the process we have been contributing. So it's a bit different from the other ones. This really have been aiming at policy. So we have been working with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which is sort of the EU of Southeast Asia, where they have different working groups. And we have mainly been working with the ASEAN, the working group for social forestry, which is sort of how farmers and local people engaging in forestry and forest landscapes. And ASEAN have developed the food, agriculture and forestry vision and strategy for 2016 to 2025, which has been the basis for our work, and you will see that very soon. But it's important to maybe start to see sort of really what are the major drivers of change in the Southeast Asia region. It is really rapid economic growth, as you know, in many of the countries. It's a lot of regional integration and globalization, but it's also a very high pressure on the natural resource base, including climate change. So all this sort of rapid economic growth is coming to a price, partly caused in the region, but also partly caused by more global drivers. And I just wanted to highlight this one so you really see sort of the climate change related hazards, and the redder the map is, the more vulnerable for various climate extremes, events, the areas are, and you can see that, and of course you hear in the news, it's a lot of those very, very vulnerable areas in Southeast Asia, and usually where it's also extremely highly populated. And that is a little bit the background to some of the texts that have been written into this vision and strategic plan for the ASEAN cooperation in food, agriculture and forestry, where one of the points says increased resilience to climate change, natural disasters and other shocks. And it's there, one of the means to do that is to expand resilient agroforestry systems where ecologically and economically appropriate. So this is sort of the entry points for the work we have been engaged with, that this vision and strategic plan was there. Some of my colleagues and partners, of course, have been interacting also in this process, but it was before I moved there. I've been living there for the last 3 years. So climate change is the entry point. I would say in reality, it's also conflicts on land, conflicts between agriculture and forestry, that the governments own all the forest land, but people in reality are living there and partly living from it. But the governments in Southeast Asia don't really want to put on paper this type of conflicts and things in relation to that, but they all really sort of are on the climate change agenda. So they do it sort of on the climate change agenda, but they try, and that is also the social forestry idea, to resolve other issues in very, very highly populated areas. So this has been the starting point for work that I have been reading the coordinator, maybe I should say, for World Agroforestry in Southeast Asia for the last 3 years. So sort of in that capacity, I've been engaged in this work. Just to show a little bit sort of where agroforestry is sort of in the landscape perspective and where we see the potential. Here you see what we call the forestry and the forest transition curve, going from sort of the real old forests down to the agricultural areas, but then sort of potentially back into a mosaic landscape. And agroforestry, yeah, and what we can say then, of course, a lot of ecosystem services are related to the mixed vegetation and to the occurrence of trees. So agroforestry is, of course, sort of restoring some of the very highly intensified agricultural landscapes, bringing back trees in. It's a high pressure now on actually agroforestry and rice production landscapes. Not to stop growing the rice, but to do other things around, to spread risks and also have more income. But it's also happening in reality, a lot of agriculture in the forest margins and in the forests. So it is about forest gardens and it's about trees on farms. And of course, it's always easier to talk about trees on farms than about forest gardens, but both are very much reality in Southeast Asia. Is it a new thing to talk about agroforestry and trees on farms in Southeast Asia? No, not really. It's sort of a long tradition. And this map over the Asia Pacific is showing the tree cover on agricultural land. So the forests are not on this map. And you can see that the bluer it is, the higher the tree cover is. And you can see that there are large areas with tree cover on 40, 50%, but even, of course, larger areas with tree cover like 10, 20, 30%. So this is sort of trees outside forests. And we can no longer stop counting them when we talk about climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and also as a resource. And this is sort of the global map on the same thing. So this is sort of also partly what the governments start to acknowledge, but still not fully, that you need to think about trees, not only when it's formally a forest land owned by the government, but actually when there are trees planted and managed by other people. So with agroforestry, we're sort of bridging the agriculture-forestry divide in policy and practice in order to scale up sustainable land use practices. And in response to the vision, really the first actions we have been taking based on this ASEAN Working Group of Social Forestry, where ICRAF, C4, and others are technical partners, sort of more supporting with data and experiences. We developed a series of policy briefs. And you can see that one of them is about Sweden follow agroforestry for sustainable land use. It's about agroforestry on peatlands to combine productive and protective functions. It's about agroforestry in rice production landscapes, and with more things to come. So they really wanted us to do it in this way, to look at different agroecological zones and also different priority areas. And they are sort of being translated, and actually the Burmese and Khmer translations are part of the SIANI funded expert group work, where we focused on those two countries. We did a white paper really to summarize where we stand related to agroforestry, contributing to food security and climate change adaptation and mitigation. And in June 2017, the ASEAN senior officials for agriculture and forestry commissioned the development of the ASEAN guidelines for agroforestry. And luckily, because we were thinking, okay, we might have money for someone sitting and sort of writing it, but we didn't at all have funds for the consultation, for engaging people. And that is sort of how the expert group came in. The call for that just came a couple of weeks after this decision. And so SIANI has contributed us to be able to bring people together for the consultation. And we focused then very much on, specifically on supporting Myanmar and Cambodia, because they had asked for that. Sort of other countries came in. And this is sort of just the headings in the guidelines, where you can see that it's very much starting from institutional and economic perspectives, environment, social culture, coming down to technical communication and scaling. Because very many of the hurdles, the bottlenecks, are on an institutional level when it comes to implementing agroforestry. It's not really that technically people don't know how to do. It is about incentives. It's about getting it a part of the governance system. So here you can see the Mekong group and the lady in the middle in blue next to me, Delia Katakutan. She's really the person who has been leading the writing of of the ASEAN Guidelines. Rob Finlayson, based in Indonesia, up to the right, is the coordinator of this. And then we have our partners from Myanmar, sorry, I there, down in orange, and we have Mr. Kuma up from Cambodia. So it's a mixture of people from the Mekong countries with some support from Philippines and Indonesia as well. And we had a couple of meetings with the bigger group, and then more targeted meetings in Cambodia and Myanmar to specifically see how they could develop agroforestry roadmaps. So this was sort of the big day in October this year, when after like 1 year of intensive work, the ASEAN Guidelines for Agroforestry Development was endorsed by the ASEAN Member States Ministers of Agriculture and Forestry. It's now published by the ASEAN Secretariat, the guidelines. And what they did, because they thought, oh, we cannot only like have guidelines, we actually need to make sure something is happening. It was coming out from the ASEAN Secretariat. So they have commissioned a curriculum for training of trainers in agroforestry and an agroforestry practitioner's field guide that should sort of be endorsed in the meetings in June, July 2019. So that work is going on. And then they also requested a template for creating national roadmaps. Since we, as a part of the expert group, started to do that with Cambodia and Myanmar, the Secretariat was thinking, oh, but we need to have that in all the ASEAN countries. Can you sort of please help and support with the template? So that is what's also happening now. So to summarize a little bit, sort of what have happened with agroforestry during sort of the 40 years since, for example, World Agroforestry, which is a global organization, was formed. It started very much on the technical level, up to the upper left. At field scale, I think Eva, somewhere here, you did your PhD on sort of field level agroforestry practices. Of course, we still do that, but we don't come all the way, and we don't see the full potential. So it later on moved into more of a landscape perspective and see, okay, so what would be the roles in the integration between trees and other things in agriculture in the landscape perspective? And you can see in this landscape, which is a community forestry area in northern Thailand, that there is still crops in the lowland. It is sort of agroforestry mixture of fruit trees, vegetables, banana, and other things on the slope. It's community forestry a bit higher up, and more protected forests on top, where also the communities have a role to play. So this is sort of a good example from a degraded land, what could happen in 25 years' time. So with the landscape perspective, it's a lot of work with what would be the incentives, because there is a startup plan, and sort of how can we pay for environmental services. So this was a development that came during the 90s, early 2000s, sort of in the agroforestry research and development work. Then we come down to the lady there, Rita Sharma. She is Sharma. She's from India, and India is actually the first country who adopted an agroforestry policy in 2014, and this woman was behind that, at that time working at the Ministry of Agriculture. And she's now in the steering committee of the Agriculture for Food Security 2030 program, also funded by SIDA, and we are really happy for that. She retired from the government and got a little bit more time. And then we have the flags of ASEAN, so now we also have the guidelines for agroforestry development in ASEAN. So it's really coming from the practical level at field, bringing it to landscape, but then bringing it into the policy frameworks, because otherwise it cannot really take off and be scaled up, because there are too many hurdles in this divide between agriculture and forestry, and the need for incentives and sort of a bit of startup money the first couple of years when you introduce perennial plants like trees in a system where you usually have only annual and seasonal crops. Yeah, so thank you very much.